Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Hello and welcome everyone to Read Smart, the official podcast of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. Today you join us as we meet each of the shortlisted authors for the 2025 award in the lead up to the announcement of this year's winner on the 4th of November. As always, our thanks go to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for generously supporting this podcast. In this episode, we're joined by Jason Burke, acclaimed journalist and author, whose book, The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s, is a finalist for this year's Baillie Gifford Prize 2025. Jason has been a foreign correspondent for almost 30 years and is currently the international security correspondent for The Guardian. He's well known in particular for his work on terrorism, including his Orwell Prize shortlisted book, The New Threat from Islamic Militancy, as well as The 9/11 Wars and Al-Qaeda, the true story of radical Islam, and On the Road to Kandahar, travels through the conflict in the Islamic world. He's reported from Africa, South Asia, Europe and the Middle East. In his latest work, The Revolutionists, Jason takes us inside the lives and minds of the radicals and extremists who terrorised the West in the 1970s with plane hijackings and hostage takings. It's a work of astonishing research that draws on secret documents, recently declassified government files, and original interviews with hijackers and spies, witnesses and victims. Set against the backdrop of the Cold War and with a cast of characters that includes Carlos the Jackal, the Japanese Red Army and the Red Army faction in Germany, the Baader-Meinhof gang and Osama bin Laden, the book details the ambition, reach and contradictions of these new armed groups in the context of events such as the Iranian Revolution and the Lebanese Civil War. The judges this year have praised The Revolutionists for its counterintuitive argument, tracing the decline of the left that led to the rise of radical Islam. Also noting that it's the work of a lifetime, drawing on 12 languages, and it's exactly the kind of book that this year's judges would like to champion. Welcome, Jason, and thank you for joining us today, and congratulations on being shortlisted for this year's award.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here. Lovely to be shortlisted.
So this is a very complicated story. What inspired you to write The Revolutionists?
I think it's always been something that I've been interested in, the 70s and political violence at that time. It's something I can remember when I was growing up as a teenager in the UK. Really, it crystallised as a project when I was writing another book in 2015 about the wave of militant Islamist violence of that period. And I was looking at the sort of historical roots of Islamic militancy and wrote a kind of potted history thereof, which wasn't particularly good. It didn't really work, and I dumped it. But it got me really thinking about the deep roots of political violence today and how interesting it would be to go back to the kind of origin story of it, if you like, which was in the 70s, late 60s too. And when I started looking at it, I just discovered all these events that I half remembered that I really wanted to have another look at and revisit. But I just discovered all these characters who were just absolutely compelling.
It's the story of some very improbable coalitions, isn't it? I mean, there are the groups that align with each other and the people who align with each other aren't always natural bedfellows.
Well, you'd think not now, but at the time it seemed absolutely natural. The groups in the Middle East, for among the Palestinians, for example, and groups in the West would fight together, would collaborate. In fact, as I discovered, and as a reader will discover, they certainly shared some vocabulary, they shared some enemies, but there was an awful lot that divided them, and that rapidly became apparent. In fact, most of the collaborations were largely failures, but they were there because that was what people were doing. There was a moment of very much international violence and solidarity too. And that was really interesting because it meant that I could trace both tracks ideologically, the Middle Eastern track and the European track, starting from the same place, but ending in very different ones. And that was what I was really interested in doing. as an intellectual argument.
And it's a brilliantly rendered dramatic account as well. I mean, they're united by being secular, weren't they? And when you say they start from the same place, where is that starting point?
They start from the late 60s and that incredible moment of radical energy. They were all seeking dramatic transformation of culture, society, economy, politics, a revolution, basically. And at the time, they were pretty much exclusively broadly secular, or at least in the Middle East, much more secular than was the norm in broader society, left-leaning, progressive in many of their values, internationalist, and seeking the overthrow of imperialism, capitalism, Zionism, associated other global evils in their view. And they ended up in very different places, as I say, which is what interested me. In the West, you end up with something that is very unideological in many ways by the early 80s, all about identity, all about nuclear disarmament or nuclear weapons, about interest groups, about all sorts of particular interests that are quite Western in many ways. And in the Middle East, you end up with pretty much radical Islam as the dominant form of protest and dissent. And those are so dramatically different. It was really intriguing to see how that had occurred.
Tell us why you prefer to write about terrorism as a practice rather than terrorists as people in the book.
I managed to write a 700-page book about terrorism without using terrorist as a noun. So, look, it's an incredibly vexed area and one that's difficult to navigate. And my own personal compromise is that I will use terrorist as an adjective because I think it's useful and I think we can define it fairly clearly and carefully. I don't think we should jettison the idea of terrorism either, because that can be defined. We know what it's like in a technical sense, even if most people use it in a much more normative sense, much more politicized and subjective sense. But I don't think calling an individual a terrorist helps us very much understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how it can be prevented, in the same way that reducing any violent criminal to a single word descriptor illuminates their undoubtedly multiple motivations. So I avoided it. And I mean, that's a position that, you can criticize, and there are legitimate criticisms of that, and I accept them. But I think it has advantages that outweigh the drawbacks.
Yeah, and you apply it consistently, and there are certainly terrorist acts described in the book, aren't there?
Absolutely. So the adjective works.
Yeah,
we can
absolutely
point to an act and say that is a terrorist act by the kind of technical definition that's most widely accepted, which is useful and important as well.
Yeah.
But just to say he was a terrorist, which a lot of people did at the time, it isn't necessarily helpful, or she was a terrorist, as a lot of people were doing at the time, importantly. But so that's where I ended up. But as I say, that's a discussion that is ongoing and should be ongoing.
Yeah, and I think it's something that any person who writes about politics and culture and complex areas has to deal with. And I think what the prize is about is there's always a tension between condemning and understanding. And if we simply condemn stuff, we're never going to understand it. But if we pursue understanding too vigorously, we can be accused of not condemning enough. But in the end, this prize is all about understanding things.
Yeah, and that is a debate that plays out in the book itself. I mean, which was actually helpful. So I can show the debates in 1972 at the UN about what terrorism is supposed to be. I look at the way governments name terrorists or terrorism and how that feeds into their strategies in how they're going to keep their citizens safe. So that was another way of dealing with that discussion in that it's actually kind of embedded in the narrative.
But you're dealing with very specific circumstances in a very specific period in this book. And there's a veritable rogues gallery in the Revolutionists. I mean, tell us a little bit about Carlos the Jackal, perhaps the most famous exponent of terrorism from that period in the book.
Carlos is an incredible character. Now, his real name is Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. And because I don't refer to any other character by their kind of nom de guerre, I don't see why I should refer to Carlos by his. So, I call him Ilich Ramirez Sanchez because it's his name. And he is an extraordinary character and actually sort of stands out from all the others because he's really not very interested in the ideology at all. He's very interested in himself. When I got in touch with him in prison in France, and we had this weird correspondence which then tailed off when I started asking quite difficult questions. But initially he sent me these packages of documents and notes, and they were all about him. I mean, there was nothing much about the kind of context. It was all about him. He sent me biographical notes about his childhood and his youth. He sent me cuttings. I mean, absolutely sort of narcissistic sociopath, but with two major talents. One for making friends, sort of seducing people in all senses, and another for manipulating or at least exploiting the media, which in the mid-70s was there to be exploited. A huge explosion of coverage and so forth, which meant that he had that opportunity and he took it and really, really benefited from it. And so looking at the kind of the myth, how the myth was created, who he actually was fascinating. And I mean, and I felt the same as others. At the time, I mean, he's absolutely repellent in so many ways. But then I wrote like 7 chapters, 8, 9, 10 chapters about him because he's so fascinating.
It's shocking to think that he's made it to old. He made old bones.
Yeah, well, he's been in prison since '94, so the older bit of it can't have been a great deal of fun. But the other thing that struck me with him, who his first attempted murder was when he was 23, and he was basically defunct by about 15 years later as a actor. It was no longer really operative, but even that is a much longer career than most of the people in the book, and he was even older than quite a lot of people in the book who were just they're just out of their teens. Some of them are in their teens. It was just really young people, and that was something that struck me.
You show how a number of these groups were backed by, certainly in Europe, communist intelligence agencies like the KGB and the Stasi. I mean, how hard in general was it to track down all of the networks of influence and support in this story?
There's been a lot of really good recent scholarship that helped enormously. So the role that, say, East German security services, primarily the Stasi, obviously, played in supporting, though absolutely not funding, founding or running. Actually, I'll say that again. So there's an awful lot of recent scholarship that's been really useful, particularly that looking at Cold War support for terrorist outfits, radical left-wing outfits. That support was sometimes marginal, actually, and often variable. It certainly wasn't critical in the creation of these groups or their longer-term campaigns, but it was there often. So there's the recent scholarship. There's now a lot of information emerging from the Western side. Documents have been declassified, big reports, people talking for the first time about their operations. particularly from Eastern Europe. Where the big gap is the Soviet archives from that period, which opened up for a very small period of time and then shut again. And we simply don't really know what the KGB was thinking and doing, apart from in a couple of specific instances. And I found a couple. And what I really showed that was really, really amazing was, this was in Arabic documents about one of the Palestinian armed group leaders who went to Moscow, was how kind of difficult that relationship was. And it was absolutely not kind of client and sponsor as a relationship. And this particular leader was pushing back very hard against the Soviets. Soviets were telling him to rein in a lot of these more violent, more spectacular attacks. He didn't want to do that. They were saying you shouldn't have any civilian casualties, as it were. Collateral damage is bad. And he said, well, what did you do in Berlin in 45? And so the relationships were fractious. They were not, absolutely not, you do this, okay, fine, I'll go and do it. I mean, it was, give and take at the very least. And that was really interesting to get into.
Sort of much more of a sort of ad hoc alliance and opportunism on both sides.
Yeah, they're actors, all with different agendas. And the Soviets spent most of their time trying to control the groups on the ground and getting them to do what they wanted them to do was very hard. So, and the groups obviously just wanted supplies, and they wanted logistic assistance, they wanted training, they wanted technology, diplomatic cover, passports, all this sort of thing. And so it was a complex relationship. It certainly wasn't, as was depicted in the US at the time, and I go into that as well, a tentacular octopus of the KGB controlling every possible dissident, terrorist, whatever, across the entire planet.
Tell us a bit more about the sources for this book. I mean, you draw on a colossal range of sources. I mean, you're a very experienced writer. Presumably you knew when you embarked upon this thing that you were about to descend into an entire library of source material.
I absolutely didn't. I was unbelievably naive. I thought it would take me a couple of years. And it took a decade. The part of it is just, I'm a reporter, so when I start pulling a thread, I kind of keep pulling it. Also, I have a tendency, a kind of very nerdy tendency to disappear down rabbit holes. And it got completely ridiculous in terms of, sorting out which group was doing what, when, and the alphabet soup of different acronyms for the various factions. And then, then I got into the whole Cold War, the much greater kind of geopolitical level of everything that was going on from Latin America across to the Asia Pacific region. I felt I had to know about all of that. And then American foreign policy, and I dived into that. And then in the end, I found myself reading biographies of Kissinger, and eventually I had to sort of, you have to draw a line. So the sources, one thing I tried to do with the sources was to use as many non-standard texts as possible when I'm looking at the secondary sources. So a lot of what I was writing about had primarily been pretty well trawled, but only through US or Israeli source material. And that was just being recycled. So testing that against Arabic language material, against European communist era secret services material, reporting in France, open source, so newspapers, closed source, so archives, and also material that showed actually what intelligence services were thinking, rather than what they were pushing into the public domain. All of that was time consuming, certainly, but really kind of fascinating. And then there were the people. So I spent a lot of time tracking down pretty much anybody who could speak to this vast subject, and just spending as long with them as possible. And that was sometimes the actors who'd been involved, Leila Khaled or some of the spies or some of the Germans, other among the Palestinians, contacts with Carlos, particularly Iranian leftists who I spent a lot of time looking at and made some friends among. And that was just fantastic and really illuminating. But also just placing that in its much broader context. So just talking to diplomats and talking to spooks and talking to even business people who'd been in the region at the time, tourists, anyone. And that was great. But I mean, by the end of it, the amount of material was just insane. I mean, it's all like most of it's obviously is digital, so it's all kind of filed on computers and hard disks and everything. But there's quite a lot of it wasn't, because at the time, so I was ordering, back copies of magazines from the 70s, and obviously half of them aren't digitized, so there'd be stacks of old French and English and language and Spanish and whatever Arabic language periodicals arriving from like 1973 or something. I mean, it got very silly.
It sounds fantastically stimulating, I've got to say.
It was fun.
Yeah.
It was fun. Yeah. And the music was great. I used to listen to the music a lot, and I read novels all around it. So
what did you read? Is there any particular novel that captured the time?
Well, Maggie Mahfouz is brilliant for Egypt at the time. Ibrahim Sonola was great on kind of, again, Egypt. Lots of Israeli stuff, Amos Oz and people writing about that period. I mean, and then there's, Heinrich Boll on West Germany in that period, and Doris Lessing's a bit later, The Good Terrorist, but it's still very interesting on, I was even reading David Lodge, the history man, on the 70s and the whole new left and the world that my characters were inhabiting. And that was brilliant. Norman Mailer, I mean, on the late 60s in the US, and I took lines from it. I mean, there's this fantastic line from Mailer about, the fanatics and the fuck-ups that he calls them, of his, comrades and inverted commas in the New Left. I mean, it was just, that stuff was brilliant.
Talking of characters, I was fascinated by the Swedish student, Gunnar Ekberg. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, Gunnar was brilliant for a variety of reasons. He's a really strong character, a young man in Sweden with pretty firm convictions that are kind of centre-right. I mean, he's in no way a kind of radical right-winger. He's a committed Democrat who grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War in Scandinavia, and was recruited by a probably illegal branch of the Swedish Secret Services to infiltrate the Palestinians. First to infiltrate left-wing groups in Sweden, and then the Palestinian armed factions in the Middle East. And this was all in about 1968, 69. And he's very successful. He ends up spying for the Swedes and for the Mossad, and gets very close to leaders in the Middle East of these Palestinian factions, who by this stage are actually launching bombing attacks and abductions and so forth in Europe, including really famous ones like the triple hijacking in September 1970 that I started the book with, or the Munich attacks in 1972 on the Olympics in Munich. And he's quite close to the people who are involved. And he has a brilliant memory and lots of documents to back up what he's saying. And I could find lots more and speak to other people, just like as a journalist would do, and a historian, just to check his recollections for accuracy and for reliability. And his story is amazing. He was, as far as I know, the only Western spy to get anywhere near the kind of access that he got. He was in training camps in Lebanon. He was in the office of the most sought after terrorist mastermind in the period, and actually doing missions for them, including an extraordinary one that he had to tell the Mossad about, that was then aborted by the Mossad. I mean, they foiled it. And we spoke lots. We met in Malmo in southern Sweden, where he lives, and talked about the 70s over beers in a railway pub. It was great. He's a brilliant character. It all ended for him with the sort of espionage in 73, 74. He was always an amateur, and he went on to a successful career in advertising.
Although the book took you an awful long time to write, it seems that it's been sort of published at the right moment somehow, that the affinities, I think, between the differences as well as the similarities between the 70s and now are really quite shocking and surprising. I mean, did you feel that when you were finishing your manuscript up? And tell us a bit about that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, there are affinities, and I felt that very strongly. The book examines those affinities is partly by design, because I got kind of halfway through it and thought, I don't want to write a book about just terrorism any longer. I'm interested in radicalism in a much broader context, if you like, for the violence. But also it's just inevitable. I mean, that was a period of massive and rapid disruptive change in the media, in economics, in politics. It was a period of deep distrust of politicians in the Western world and elsewhere, populism, paranoia, all these.
Palestine, the other P.
And clearly, and the Palestinian issue, if you like, was really foregrounded through the whole period in a way that is very similar to now, and mobilizing many of the same people effectively, the same type of people, and even using the same vocabulary quite often. So I was really struck by how a lot of the vocabulary that is now used to describe the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, to put it broadly, is the same language that was being often coined, actually, was being coined back in the late 60s and the early 70s. The vocabulary has remained in some ways almost unaltered, which was really interesting.
What do you hope readers will take away from the book? I mean, it's a broad question, but
that was a good one. I want people to be entertained. I really want people. It's a big book, but the material is, for me anyway, exciting and gripping enough for it just to be a hell of a read. I want people to get to the end of it and just sort of go, whoa, wow, that was like when you come out of a cinema and you're kind of blinking in the light and you're just like, wow, that was intense. So I want that kind of technicolor effect. I want it to be immersive so that people really feel that they were there. And then maybe a bit later to realize that they've understood something about why individuals, particularly young individuals, turn to violence that they didn't know before.
Yeah. Well, it's a brilliantly successful exercise in world building for sure, and hugely readable, the kind of book you read till 2:00 in the morning on a Wednesday night.
Oh, good. That's nice.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason, and very, very best of luck in the final round of the prize.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you.
We'd like to thank again the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued and generous support of this podcast. The winner will be announced, as I said at the top of the programme, on the 4th of November, at an award ceremony also generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation on the 4th of November. The announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books or the progress of this year's prize, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok at BG Prize. Many thanks for listening. Until next time.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.